We are live. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to now share this link on Twitter because I suspect nobody is looking yet because I haven't yet shared the link. Okay.
Ok, il y a du délai, c'est normal.
Thanks for your help, guys.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
Nice. Okay, we are now live. Cool. Can you rename the name of it there on edit? Is that possible?
Sure, I think.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
works. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Where do you want to edit?
Can you edit the name to just live stream European Parliament?
Sure. It works.
Yeah. Can you edit the name to just live stream
From European Parliament?
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, amazing. Thank you. And I'm not going to keep hearing this audio, am I? You know how I can hear the audio of myself repeating?
Well, you just heard yourself here. So it means it's work, but you can't hear yourself there because there was a delay of 20 seconds.
Okay, cool. I was hearing it on here. That's good to know. All right, so cool. All right. I assume that maybe people will start joining us now. So, hi everybody. Naomi here. I thought it would be cool to do a live from Parliament because basically a lot of stuff goes on here and it's actually kind of hard to follow. So I thought I would just take any questions that anyone might have. So I assume you're following me on Twitter, which is where I shared the link. So just like at me, at Naomi O'Reilly, and I will try my best to answer your questions. As you can see, I'm in this cool studio here in the basement of the Parliament, and I have some awesome guys who are helping me to do this live stream. And these facilities are here to try and increase public understanding of this institution, so let's use them. Later on, I may be joined by MEP Maria Walsh of Fine Gael. She said that she will try and come down during votes. My basic idea is that I think it would be cool to have a chat with every Irish MEP. So try and take one MEP and talk to them about like their defining policy issue, the one that is their passion, that they're most overridingly interested in, and try to understand how do they try to affect change on that issue through their position of MEP. So I think they all have a different approach to doing that. Some are like nerds in terms of like the lawmaking and legislation aspect, and others are more sort of like act as campaigning advocates. I would say that Maria Walsh is more on that side, but we can hear from her. So yeah, anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And maybe I thought I would start by breaking down what exactly the European Parliament does. Like, it sounds like a simple question, but actually, I know a lot of people get confused between like what is the difference between, for example, an MEP and a European Commissioner, right? Because on the face of it, they're both public representatives or public positions in the EU, in Brussels and Strasbourg, that are doing stuff to do with policy. But they have really different roles and they're appointed really differently. And I think that the kind of way that they're appointed and the division of powers in the bloc is really, really, really important to understanding how EU legislation is made, how this bloc all works, and so on. So, basically, the European Commission proposes policy, so it comes up with policy ideas. It's full of like civil servants and sort of legislative experts and stuff that work on that. Then they put together a policy package and they lay it out, and then it goes to the European Council. What is the European Council? It's just a word for the member state governments. So the 27 member state governments then have a look at this idea of the European Commission. It's not like the European Commission came up with this idea all by themselves. They do this in response to kind of requests from the member states and stuff. So, excuse me, and what they perceive to be needs. So then the European Council will look at this policy and consider, like, what do they think of it? This might be anything from, like, reform of migration to economic issues in the bloc, absolutely anything. And the European Parliament considers it as well. So then the way it works is then that the Council and Parliament come up with their own sort of consensus opinions on whatever this policy is. So if it's a green issue, like how are we going to cut our carbon emissions in order to meet carbon neutrality by 2050? then the European Parliament will have some view like, oh, we need to hit this industry with this, and we need to do these tweaks, and we need to do that. It's a very it's a very complicated process to come up with one position that represents all of the 650 MEPs that are elected throughout the EU and passes with a majority, but that's what they work on. And then the European Council does the same, where they, between the member state governments, figure out something that is acceptable to Germany, is acceptable to Italy, is acceptable to France, acceptable to Ireland, and so on. And then at that point, the three institutions all come together and they come up with like the final thing that's approvable to all of them. So what this means is like you have these policy issues that are discussed for years. So that is why you can have this impression like things are moving really slowly, and nothing's being done, or there's all this debate and fighting and stuff. It's a really, really long negotiating process involved in like forming consensus in these different institutions, and then the different institutions forming consensus among themselves. And also, like, as a journalist, how do you report something like that? Especially since, like, if you just take, for example, this is I'm going to show you some of the policy, the stuff that's up for debate here in the Parliament. It's like, okay, humanitarian security situation in Afghanistan, health union, so cross-border cooperation on health, LGBT rights and anti-discrimination in the EU, attacks on media freedom and the rule of law in Poland. Like, there's all this stuff going on. And most of the time, none of these debates are make or break. They're just, discussions. So different MEPs will say stuff, and then they'll usually, like, call for something. They don't decide something, if you know what I mean. They don't actually set policy in most of this discussion that goes on. So, like, as a journalist, it can be really difficult to know exactly when and how do you delve into all of these important issues that are being discussed, because you don't want to create a false impression that something's going to happen because of this. Because, like, a lot of the time, it's a discussion, it's a debate, and that's all it is. It's not actually going to have a policy outcome. Or at least there will be a policy outcome, but, like, it'll be, like, in 2.5 years' time, and there's a lot of detail to be worked out before that. Anyway, so the European Parliament is an interesting beast in itself, so I'll talk a little bit about that. If Fine Gael's Maria Walsh joins us, where she sits in this Parliament is in this, I don't know if you can see this, sort of dark blue bit here, the EPP. EPP means European People's Party. It's basically like the right of centre political groups in the EU. It's the biggest bloc. It's been dominant for a long time. It used to be much more dominant because it used to have Angela Merkel and like a huge sort of array of all of the top leaders in Europe. So they used to joke that like actually the policy was actually set at EPP meetings because they had Merkel and they had all these other leaders, rather than at the actual council meetings where all the member states met. But its influence is waning because it's in trouble because, well, Merkel's leaving. They don't have so many leaders in government anymore. After Merkel, there will only be Sebastian Kurz in Austria and then like a bunch of people over to the east. And this is giving like a whole flavour to the internal politics of the EPP, which is that it's more and more dominated by Eastern right-wing forces, which are sometimes quite at odds with the members of the EPP, which are from the West. Like Fine Gael isn't actually a great fit with some of these, which is something I hope to ask Maria about. So yeah, all of this may change. We'll have to see. All of the like decisions that get made in the European Parliament, like the consensus on big policy packages, whether to pass European law or reject it, whether to appoint the Commission to approve, the member states nominate the members of the Commission, and then the European Parliament like approves them, right? So all of those decisions about whether or not to do that, who to appoint people to keep positions, this all depends on finding a majority in this Parliament. And usually it's like EPP plus, so like centre-right plus centre-left or something. Like there'll be some sort of arrangement like that. And they appoint all the key positions in the EU according to like the proportion that you see here. So like say this is like, I don't know, 32% or whatever it actually is. Like 32% of the top positions then should go to EPP. And then like 18% or whatever it is should go to the socialists. And whatever, you know, that's kind of how they divide it up. That's how it works. Cool. I'm going to check and see if anyone has any questions for me. Okay, so one came in from Thomas Conway on Twitter, and he said, in terms of the schism, am I saying that right, between new Hanseatic League countries and southern states, would you notice this divide in the European Parliament, or are matters debated along partisan lines, so like party groupings, like EPP and ALDE, and so on? ALDE is now called Renew. So that's a really, really good point. So particularly in the aftermath of Brexit, lots of member states are figuring out like new power alliances among the member states. Because obviously, in order to get your point of view forward, member states have to make alliances, no matter how big they are. They need to get other people on board. And you need to get a majority, so not a majority, unanimity, to actually pass like really, really key stuff. So it needs to please everybody. But what a lot of these alliances serve to do is more to shape the direction of how things go, or block things that they don't like, for example. It's easier to block things than it is to make things happen, because of, it's much harder to get a majority than like a blocking minority. So Ireland, for example, has been since 2016, something like that, kind of exploring this alliance, sometimes with like the Netherlands and Sweden. Sometimes it was given this name, which is called like the New Hanseatic League. Ireland doesn't always agree with them on stuff. Like, for example, Ireland, sometimes this crowd is called the Frugals, right? They're like, don't spend any more money, EU. That's kind of their view. Ireland had a different view when it came to, if you're aware of this, like the massive joint borrowing thing that was agreed last year to counteract the economic damage of COVID. Sorry if I'm overloading you with detail here, but sometimes anyway, Ireland does club together with this other group of states for common interest stuff, because they do have stuff in common, and sometimes that's called the Hanse League. And then they have a different view to the Mediterranean countries. There's particularly on economics, like Mediterranean countries, a lot of them want more EU, and particularly sort of they call more social Europe. So a Europe that's looking more after like people's quality of life and stuff, a more spendy EU, an EU that isn't so concerned with the rules about fiscal governance of economies and how much debt you're allowed to have and how much of a deficit you're allowed to have. So yeah, there's that divide. That's one of the key divides. There's also an east-west divide that comes up in Europe as well, particularly on sort of like social liberalism issues. Does this translate into the parliament? Well, it does and it doesn't. So like one of the interesting things about this parliament is, okay, so you have these groups which sort of replicate what you'd see in a national parliament. So sort of centre-left, centre-right, Greens, others, and so on. But if you actually look at what the MEPs do, they often vote along national lines. So there's not very much party discipline. It kind of depends. So, you'd often see the Irish MEPs voting as a bloc, even though there's a lot of differences between the Irish MEPs. So, like, most notably, 4 Irish MEPs sit in the left group, which wouldn't usually be agreeing with the likes of Fine Gael, but on some stuff which is really important to Ireland, like the Brexit stuff, for example, they would be working as a team. So that's an interesting thing that happens, and that's also observable on other things. Even if you have centre-left and centre-right in different countries and they fit together into these groups, the meaning of centre-left and centre-right can differ between different member states. So that's that. What was I saying? Let me see if I have any other questions. I got an interesting one earlier. Oh yeah, it was like, as a journalist, like how much do you cover the European Parliament? Well, kind of like, as I was saying, like the mess of different topics that go on. This is a copy of the agenda. Right now we're in plenary, which is like when all the MEPs gather and they have all these big votes. It goes on Monday to Thursday. The big sort of debates are on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then there's a whole load of voting on Thursday. And yeah, like the sort of stuff that's on is like I'm just pulling this out, natural disasters in Europe, situation in Afghanistan, situation in Lebanon, direction of EU-Russia political relations, EU blue card directive, like it just goes on. So it's like how do you even pick one? And so much of this stuff will be like really incremental process, like progress. So it's like, when exactly do you choose to do that story? So I find that like quite a lot of the reporting about the European Parliament is stuff to do with like if an MEP does something unexpected, basically. It's quite personality based because the policy questions, like the way that the European Parliament has power is on this sort of like grinding legislative work that is like spread out over a very long period of time. It is really important. Like they actually decide the wording of legislation. Like they form the expression of what the other EU institutions want to do, like into law. And the wording of sentences, like the uses of words and so on, that's really, really, really key. Like that will actually affect how this policy works on the ground in terms of like, you know, the actual citizen. So it's really important, but it's a grinding long-term thing. And it's rare that you have these like big moments that sort of like lend themselves easily to news, if you know what I mean. So we don't necessarily hear about it that much. So I'm going to check if Maria's on her way and see if she's texted me. Imagine if I get ghosted by Maria Walsh, I'll be so upset. Okay. No update. I think she's like got a lot of votes and stuff, so she did say that she might be late. I'm going to see if anyone's put a question on the actual YouTube live stream. I don't know if what I've said has given like help or has been helpful for like your questions and your understanding. Oh yeah, Frank Connolly says, will this stream be recorded? Yeah, it'll be recorded. It'll be left here. I should probably say actually, so this stream right now happens to be being done over the Irish Passport account, right? The account of my podcast. I'm actually here reporting for the Irish Times. I wanted to stream this directly on my Twitter, so like literally using my Twitter handle directly in a live stream. But there's a complication to do with the technicality of using an external camera rather than just streaming from your camera phone. And it was impossible for me to do that with an external camera, so I had to sort of borrow my podcast's YouTube account at the last minute to do this live stream. But hopefully I can get that sorted in the future. I'll just do it directly on my Twitter. Brian Hannigan says, do you think there'll be a review of the EU vaccine procurement in late 2020? That's a really interesting question. I don't know what your guys' thoughts is about the EU procurement process with vaccines and how it went. Like, oh, I hear a familiar voice. There's more to say about that. One of the really interesting things is like, oh, hey, Maria.
How you doing? Am I allowed to
Please.
Apologies for being late.
No, you're fine. Just about on time, and I know you're mad busy with votes and everything.
Nice to meet you in person.
Lovely to meet you in person.
I'll give you my elbow.
Yeah.
Could you just a little bit to your right? Yes, great.
Am I allowed to take this off, or
Yes,
can I keep
you
on?
are.
Are you comfortable with that?
I'm okay with that. Yes. So yeah, thank you so much for making the time. And I know it's mad busy at the moment, and it's frenzy during the plenary. So yeah,
The
thank
height.
you so much.
You're getting at a really good time where everybody's back from spring break. Every meeting has been triple booked, but I'm delighted to be here.
Cool.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So yeah, I was just explaining to the people who are already logged on that I kind of want to explain a bit more about how the European works, what the European Parliament works, what is the role of MEPs, and how do they sort of express their mandate, like whether it's through the examination of legislation or the kind of, I suppose, advocacy that you've been doing.
Yeah.
So lately you were at these two quite interesting things. You went to, correct me if I'm wrong, a gay pride parade in Tbilisi, right?
Yeah.
And you were on Lesbos meeting migrants. Maybe we can start with the gay pride.
Yeah.
What was that like? Why did you go there?
Well, two in particular. One in Budapest,
Okay.
and then the other with Copenhagen, who held World Pride.
Okay.
Particularly with the Budapest, given the very recent and ongoing anti-LGBTI sentiment that's coming out of Orban's government.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted to make a physical presence, both as an LGBTI woman myself, as an activist and an ally, because I don't think you can be one without the other two. And while I might align with only one letter of the rainbow, there's no balance for all letters of the rainbow. So our trans community in particular, even in Ireland, we don't have equality there. And then for me, the fact that Fidesz, which is where Orban sits, in case anybody has been following what's going on within his regime, you know, the fact that he sat for so long in the EPP, and for a long time, and rightly so, Fine Gael MEPs were held account to that decision.
Right.
As a gay woman, I was held account to that. It was probably one of the only questions that were Euro-specific over the 2019 campaign. So for me, specifically being and physically being in Budapest at a time when the community needed it the most, I think was very important to show political willingness there. And then the same thing as an EPP group member going to World Pride in Copenhagen. I think the centre needs to show and not just pink rainbow flagging, that we are very aware and very conscious.
So you're kind of on the ground there.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to get back to the EPP question because I do think that's really, really interesting. But first of all, can you just describe actually what was Budapest Pride like? Was it scary? I know some of the marches in Poland have been attacked and stuff. Do you see that kind of on the ground tension in Budapest?
Yeah, from a personal standpoint, kind of keeping off my rainbow hat of politics. You know, I've been so fortunate. I've attended Pride parades in Dublin, in Galway, in the likes of Philadelphia and New York and elsewhere. And there's always an energy about Pride. One of like great vibrancy. You know, the entertainment value is phenomenal. The love is infectious, like it's gorgeous. And then people are involved in that. So like,
and it was the same kind of atmosphere in Budapest?
No, not at all. Like in many ways, I showed up a number of hours early before the Pride kicked off, and there was riot gear being worn and put on. There was no bunting. There was one flag coming out of a window. No businesses were out in pride in the fact that it was going to happen. Even on the main square where it took off, it was very subdued, which for me as an out gay woman was very different. Now, in the hours that went on, and as the parade was about to kick off, it certainly filled up with the thousands of people, young and old, gay and straight, which was fantastic, but very, very different to the experiences.
Slight tension there. So.
Yeah, and then bear in mind, and I posted it, you know, there was the Rainbow March route plan, you know, which most cities and towns do when they're celebrating Pride, but on that was little black emojis outlining where any anti-LGBT people could come together and gather and protest in their own right. And that was the first time I'd ever seen that.
You saw the counter-protesters.
Yeah.
So what do you think is behind the use of the Orban government, the use of that they make of this LGBT issue as a kind of culture wedge? What is it for? Because we've seen this kind of dog whistle anti-Semitism previously from his government. He also sort of scapegoats the EU, or, you know, you might have lawyers or civil society being scapegoated. Why now the gay community? I
think it's what we call a Christmas tree, or the political ping pong. And for anybody watching this, I mean that in the sense of they dangle the likes of minority groups, the likes of other, to create this very anti-angry fear sentiment, making this nuanced or quite direct, in Orban's case, thought in people's minds that if you go for the other, or we allow the other in, then you're going to lose all the things that you know. So like that greener pastures idea.
So it's whipping up the base kind of thing, solidifying his support.
Yeah. Now, in speaking with more left-leaning representatives in Hungary, because we do a lot of work here on the LGBTI intergroup here in the Parliament, where we speak out against, and all of our work is very in unison in many ways, because we're trying to have a very clear picture of what we want and what we need for equality across the European Union. But in speaking with other LGBTI members, the other voices growing momentum. They'll see elections in the coming months, if not now. Actually, I think the opposition is coming together, forming one, if not two leaders, and then they will fight together against Orban. And I think that organised, very strategic thinking is what could potentially offset what Orban is moving towards, which I don't think is a bad thing. But if anybody has been following Orban for many years, he didn't start off like this. He actually was more liberal than many, even many in the Fine Gael party. And then over the years, I think figured out a way to stay in office, lost office for a previous point. Research focus group from rural settings was telling him you need to get more extreme, more right. And he followed that, and he's remained in office since. So I think it's more political, strategic value than it is about society as a whole.
So now the EPP was blamed a lot for actually enabling the rise to power of Orban, and also his consolidation of power, because he uses access to EU funds and access to that very powerful network that the EPP provided between Merkel and everybody else to reward allies, to solidify his community in Hungary in positions of power. And then, they've finally not in the EPP anymore, but it took a very long time. And I know there were other parties in the EPP that always wanted a conciliatory approach to, and also there's a self-interest there, right? Because the more parties you have in your bloc, the more seats you have, the more power you have, and you don't want to voluntarily give up power. But my question is, because all of that stuff to do with Fidesz and the EPP has been kind of rehearsed, my question is what now? Because right now the Angela Merkel is going out of office. EPP probably won't have Germany. It's going to have Austria and countries to the east of Austria, which are dominated by more conservative views on social rights. What is Fine Gael doing in that group? How are you personally going to deal with that conservatism, which is going to be dominant in your political group?
Yeah, to that point, I mean, Fine Gael is one of the founding fathers of the EPP. So I can't see, and I really can't see from where I'm sitting right now, we would ever leave that. I do hear you though when you say about the conservatism and the rise of it in certain blocks. But I also know in our last LGBTI plus internal vote that we did about a previous report over the summer, it was 70-30, 70% progressive and believing in equality. So when you have those numbers, and at the end of the day, those numbers are really important, because that means our legislation and our policy are as inclusive and as based on solidarity for all, not just some, is where we're relying. I certainly think it is a concern, though. I'm not going to ignore that. For me, as a progressive centrist, to see more extreme voices dominate online, never mind offline, and it's something that we need to be mindful of. But then, I mean, I'm always left with kind of scratching my head saying, if you're not at the table and making sure the other voice or a progressive voice is being discussed, then naturally you do see a rise. So I don't represent just Midlands Northwest in what I do. I also represent the European Union in many ways. Hence the reason why I went to the likes of Budapest or Copenhagen, why I went to Lesbos just last week around speaking with refugees and asylums to better understand, in order for me to equip the arguments when
facing with this, and the opposite view. And
if it's coming, it's coming. But I think our problem, I think, is not necessarily about the rise of left or right. It's the fact that as a centrist party, be it Fine Gael or the EPP, we need to figure out where our voice is, and we need to figure out where and how we're aligning with others, because ultimately that's how you proceed, and that's how you make sure all voices are included.
On migration, this is a really, really interesting topic, because for many countries, the primary concern in the wake of Afghanistan is the question, does this mean more migrants are coming to our shores? It's not, what's the place of the EU in the world, or how can we help these people? It's more, does this mean more migration? So the response of parties, particularly in your own group as well, is concerned with migration, preventing it, getting rid of asylum seekers or dissuading them, deporting people. And I know, like, you yourself were dragged over the coals on Twitter for a vote in which you went along with the EPP in sort of voting against increased rescue efforts in the Mediterranean. I can foresee the EPP having to have lots of votes on migration issues where your personal political profile is going to be quite at odds with what the party wants to do. Do you foresee this being a problem?
Not for me personally or politically. I think at the end of the day, you got to ask. I have to ask myself, am I doing the best for the constituents I represent? And is my values and in what I'm seeing on the black and white sheet of a page standing up to the values of why I decided to get off the armchair and run in the first place in 2019? For me, there's a lot of I don't want to say disinformation, but there's a lot of discolour around the 144 characters of a tweet, and what is actually in the body and the breadth of the work that we do here is not obviously and always relayed. Now, that's not pointing the finger at the other voices that are getting their game together. It's the likes of myself who need to ensure that I'm putting my message out correctly and effectively, and speaking to those that are going through what the experience of being a refugee and asylum seeker arriving onto our shores, be it legal or illegal pathways, to the point of Afghanistan, and we're going to be debating it probably already on now. Yeah, just momentarily. It's fascinating that to me as a society and as a country, our immediate effect is how does this affect us versus how can we help people legally and safely arrive to our shores. I mean, we're a country of immigration. We built more towns and cities and countries throughout the world than I think any other country, and that's something we're really proud of. Hell, we even have Kate Mila Fáilte as our tourism tagline. But how do we turn and flip the script that our communities are as welcoming and understanding of what is coming in and what is being welcomed in? The benefits is our classrooms and our workforce is only going to become more richer in culture. Now, to that point, that's not me being romantic about the language of migration. Migration is going to grow, and I think, and I can safely say this, in the next, our generations ahead, migration will be the main topic of conversation in the European Parliament. Yeah. It has to be, because of the rise of climate and the impact it's having in terms of famine and drought. The countries like Afghanistan that are going through the turmoil that it has been for generations, not just in the last couple of weeks. So more and more people will need to move LGBTQI rights and citizens, not women and children, not feeling safe in their own countries. But we need to ensure that we are providing space legally and safely more important than anything else, so that we don't have, like the citizens that I met in Lesbos just last week, where they're essentially stuck in their reception centre for not just 6 months or 6 weeks, but for years. And then you have children under the age of 10 that have no regular education stream. And if we're actually going to provide a shelter in the worst of storms, then we need to do that with amenities and infrastructure to do that. And I think the bigger question is going to come, how does this cost? Where is the money coming from? And how does this affect our communities? And that's where I don't want to say anti, but you do have anti-sentiment about migration in the likes of Poland and Hungary and other Eastern blocs. But for us, we have a voice. We need, as an Irish country, we have a voice, and we need to make sure it's put out there with all the factual information and not just cherry picking what might sell in the newspapers.
I think it is dominant. It's not just Hungary and Poland. I mean, it's most member states. I would say there's at least a substantial block of people that are concerned with migration. Also, I mean, let's not get into actually the policy points of this, because I think perhaps it's something for a specific discussion. Yeah, But I wanted to ask you about the makeup of European Parliament. Yeah. So I was
you have more information than I have.
It's a good sheet, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I was saying earlier that EPP is here, and then you've got these two groups that are off to the right, ECR and ID, right? They are two groups that are more right-wing than EPP, and I think the only reason why they're not one group is because they involve parties that are national rivals. So you'll have two rival right-wing parties. I don't know, let's just take Italy. You'll have two rivals. one will be in one and one will be in the other, and that's like the only reason why there's actually two different groups. It's just because they have national rivalries. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I will say, in this brilliantly pointed a piece of work here, the ID here, even on the LGBTI intergroup, we wouldn't have a member from ID. They're extremists.
They're extreme.
But to your point on ECR here, you know, we would vote quite similarly, not necessarily on social issues, but quite economical.
Okay.
But there's a number of ECR MEPs, particularly young female, that actually at a national level would sit almost in Renew, where Fianna Fáil sit.
Okay, interesting.
Or in ourselves, but they have competing demographics, or there's one or two issues like migration that they would align more with ECR. So it is, like in Ireland, we're actually probably one of the easiest countries to figure out where we sit on the map. Other European countries, it's a little bit more technical.
What do you think of this rumour, discussion, speculation about these two groups forming one bloc, one hard right bloc, ECR and ED? What do you think it's likely, and what would it mean for EPP? Would it be competing to the right? Would it make EPP go more centrist to differentiate itself?
I would hope it makes us go more centrist. That's me only speaking on behalf of myself versus the colour I'm wearing. But I wouldn't be surprised to hear that, and I wouldn't be surprised if the likes of the Hungarian Fidesz MEPs that are currently floating in the independent world will create the super bloc. I would be nervous though for the likes of free media, for the like of democracy, for the likes of the spin on this untruthful anti-anything narrative that will come out. And unfortunately, and maybe and hopefully you can agree, you know, the extreme left and the extreme right that polarised us and them is predominantly feeding more and more onto our online stream and into our print, because it has to. I mean, it's what's out there. Whereas groups like ourselves, even Renew and S&D, are really trying to find balance and bring more and more folks together on issues. Not everybody's going to win everything at the table, but certainly making sure we have enough to move forward. And I'd be nervous, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean,
about this hard right bloc coming to be a thing.
I think can I just add? I think people assume what happened in 2016 with President Trump and the movement of the Republican Party, that it just stopped in Boston or New York. It didn't. It's very much here in Europe, and hopefully not so much invested in Ireland, but we certainly see it in Europe.
How much time do you have? Because I know you have to go back to the chamber for votes and all kind of thing.
What time are we talking? What time
we're 9 minutes to 3.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah. I'm looking at my team member Emer is giving me the high. I think it's high five, but I think she's telling me 10 minutes. So
cool. I was wondering then. So, as far this is my own interpretation.
Don't make me nervous about saying we have 10 minutes now.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. But my sort of interpretation of your acts, like going to Pride, like going to Lesbos and stuff, that's using your platform as an MEP in a sort of an activist way, in terms of using your profile to draw attention to issues and things like that. Yeah, for sure. What about the legislative work of an MEP? I'd love to hear your point of view as a relatively new MEP about how the Parliament works. How does this legislative work? Beast. Yeah, there's so much of it. How do you make a difference? You know, like isn't it just cacophonous with all of these different issues and hundreds of MEPs working on them? Yeah, so I mean, for anybody watching, we've 705 MEPs. We had a little bit more before Brexit happened. We're leaving some space for hopefully more countries to join. We have a number of different committees. And then, but as an MEP, as a single identity, I vote for each piece of legislation or amendments that get passed through, which is extremely powerful when you think of it. But it's extremely difficult all the same to keep abreast of everything that's passing through. Hence the reason why we're so fortunate in Fine Gael that we have 5 MEPs. We divvy up the committee so that we're tracking them very closely. Like my main committees are employment and social affairs. My other is culture and education. I'm the only Irish MEP on that. And then I sit on as a substitute on Libe. So I wouldn't, which is home affairs or civil justice, home affairs, and legal. And that is a case of the Libe is the one that gets the most headlines and the most tweets, I think, because it's everything from migration and all its breadths and forms to like cybersecurity, cyber violence. We're passing through a piece with the FEM committee on gender-based violence right now in the coming day or two. So they're my 3 committees. Other Fine Gael or other MEPs will cover others. And it's making sure that Ireland Inc. is protected, obviously, and we take
our own positions on policies as a party, as Fine Gael, but then I also inject my own personal, beliefs and persuasion, so that a lot of feminist issues, minority issues, LGBTQI, obviously, I'm a big mental health advocate, so everything in terms of the technical detail that I have, and Emer, my team member that's out there, anything that we pass always have some sort of LGBTQI amendment to it. If it's appropriate. Mental health also, in terms of migration, we always call out and ask for more funding and awareness to age appropriate translators, because often they're not in the same, when you're speaking with a refugee and or asylum seeker, their translator is not speaking similar language to them, nor gifting them the time of day. In my employment or education committee, then we're constantly calling on access to better education, vocational education training, so we'd feed back into the national stuff a little bit, like what Minister Harris is doing. So
a lot of this is kind of calling for things, so it's making a political demand. But in order to affect change and push forward a policy, so to proactively actually cause a legislative change yourself, what's key? I understand that becoming the rapporteur for a particular issue for your political group or on your committee or so on is key to actually having a seat at the table for the actual negotiations for forming policy, rather than voting for amendments. I mean, how many amendments do you vote for?
Thousands. But to your point there, and I should have said it a little bit more clear. Like, say that gender-based violence file that we're currently working on now, I'm a shadow rapporteur on that. So the two main rapporteurs are the left and a Green. They're working together. And that will eventually, because it will be passed, it will be contentious, but it will pass. It will feed into the commission, or I like to call our management company, and to the big boys and girls sitting on the council, and that will become a Euro crime.
So this is what I was mentioning earlier about the division of powers between the different institutions, where you've got Commission proposing, Council and Parliament coming up with their unified positions. So what you're saying is that you're the person with responsibility for scrutinising the development of Parliament's consensus position on this gender-based violence bill, which will then be the position of the Parliament when it goes into the compromise negotiations with Council and Commission.
Correct.
Did I get that right?
Correct. So it'll pass through the Commission first, and then eventually make its way to the Council for all buy-in. But can I say where it goes wrong is in 2008 there's an Anti-Discrimination Directive that's currently being held up, because they needed the overall, everybody to be on board, the consensus for that. But the likes of Hungary and Poland, and I believe Germany, but I'm getting the nod, Germany didn't agree to that.
They were able to block it.
So it's been held up. And when we think Anti-Discrimination Directive, what could that mean? Well, that means didn't agree to the things like the Istanbul Convention, and the renege on the likes of Czech or Bulgaria not feeding into it or adhering to it would be stronger. The likes of even conversion therapy, which countries like our own haven't banned, would be stronger. So we need to continue to pass what we're passing and making sure we're putting pressure. Some stuff is like PR related, and that's important, like that you mentioned.
You mean like calling for stuff?
Yeah, and that's important, making sure funding is adequate to it. But it's also really important then that anything we do pass, like I'm working on a bill about pay transparency, particularly for women and other minority groups, and that will eventually lead to being a directive. So some country, well, all countries then would have anything from 1 to, on average, about 3 years to implement it into a national law. So we would have seen that with the right to disconnect legislation that just got passed recently in Ireland. I know Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was very, in his ministerial role, was a champion for that. But that would have passed in the Parliament up to, I think it was 3, maybe 4 years prior.
Okay.
So where it gets frustrating for the likes of myself, who wants everything done yesterday, it does take time, and the political ship moves a hell of a lot slower than society needs it. But it's a case of, I always try and say then we just need more of our community members involved in politics, or conversations like this where it's encouraging people to go look further into what the European Parliament does or institution does as a whole, or hopefully run themselves.
I guess the other thing is, after this stuff is passed, is the implementation, and whether something can be written on paper, but whether it actually becomes a reality on the ground in a member state is really up to the sort of will of the authorities and the people, and whether it's held to account.
And the government of the day.
Yeah. So obviously there can be great variety in terms of what's done there.
Yeah.
Based on your experience so far, what do you think the best way would be to improve the work of the European Parliament or improve people's engagement with it?
I mean, for us, it's a case of making sure people are voting. That's fundamental. In particular, in Ireland here, we have I actually think it's probably one of the most beautiful ways to do democracy and protect it, because every vote gets counted and everyone has a vote. In other countries, yes, you do have a vote, but they go by list systems. So you and I may be on a list for a certain country, and we're on that list because a party leader wants us to be on that list, versus me putting my hand up and getting involved and being one of 17, which was in my case in Midlands Northwest, and being elected based off meeting people, my merits, my party support, my party as a whole. But I think the European elections, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is it is less about the politics of today and more about what the person is seeing and wanting to commit to and deliver at a European Parliament side. That's not the case across other European countries. And then, I mean, for me, it's around connecting those that feel disconnected. And I know that sentence gets said quite a bit, but we have an amazing opportunity to increase the pilot project that's ongoing right now on politics and society in secondary schools, but it's predominantly more the higher end of secondary. Can you imagine if we reformed or re-looked at the way CSP is taught and educated and shared? I think when it's safe to do so, we should have more hustings and real honest dialogue. And I think for me, I could sit in the likes of the EPP and Fine Gael, but in EPP in particular, and still be progressive. You know, we still need people to push the envelope out, but believe in the fundamentals of why we're here. And I'm a pro-European. I don't believe in sitting in the European Parliament and being a Eurosceptic, because that means then I'm actually not doing my job to the betterment of the European Union. I'm distracting it. So there's a lot of ebbs and flows to it, but for my case, it's a thing of show up and try and push the envelope as much as possible to be inclusive as possible.
Something that MEPs sometimes mention to me, and it makes sense because it's kind of in their own self-interest, is that the Parliament should have more power. MEPs should be able to direct change more directly because they're directly elected by constituencies to go and do that, whereas there's that step remove in terms of the commission. So like obviously the commission is appointed by member state governments. They're not just sort of
picked from the sky.
Right. Yeah. They are chosen by the member states and approved by the Parliament. So there's a system there, but there's sort of layers of difference, and there's a lot of politics that goes on in terms of their appointment, and these people who people have never heard of suddenly get these positions of power, and it creates this sense of distance. Do you think, I mean, probably you'll say yes because you're an MEP, but would that be a solution to the sense of distance that people have from the EU to give more powers to Parliament? It seems a little unwieldy. I mean, all of these MEPs, it's already quite confusing what groups they're in, what would end up coming out of it.
I mean, to that point, I would love for that to eventually happen, but we're by no means there yet. I would like to see another mandate. Using the likes of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is ongoing right now, trying to feed in information, ideas and thoughts on the European Union, a part of the conference. Use that as a way, use the rest of this mandate, it's a 5-year mandate, to begin to really figure out what is being disconnected, and then really go gung-ho on educating folks about the European institutions, and that it's just not the vacuum of Brussels speak, or to your point, the issues around the Spitzenkandidat candidate that we had at the start of this mandate, that it was party specific, but our candidate, Manfred Weber, wasn't elected to president of the commission.
Because he wasn't convincing to anyone. Exactly.
So to that point, then if I'm on the outside looking in, then it's like, of course I'm confused. I mean, as a newly elected MEP, I was confused because I was like, I thought we're following protocol, but hierarchies and different conversations made different decisions. So for me, I agree with you, but I don't think I would love to see. I shouldn't say I agree with you because I don't even know if you're agreeing with it. I would love to see MEPs having more legislative action in the sense of how could
Like
how could affect
proactive,
member states directly, and not wait for other people to either buy in or not buy in.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're there yet in the sense of education of citizens. Like, we need more and more people to come out and vote, but we also need them to understand why they're voting,
Right.
and to challenge us in the sense of, well, what is it that you can do for my community?
Right. So there needs to exist a more coherent actual European polity, which just isn't a reality at the
But I
moment.
think if you ask people at home, you know, I'm Irish American. I was born in the States but raised in Ireland. I really looked at Europe as an opportunity to travel and see the world. I didn't look at it growing up as I am Irish and I am European. Where in other countries they are European and then they're their member state. So I think from an Irish standpoint, you know, there's so many benefits. Like in 1973 when we joined the marriage bar, one of the conditions of us joining the marriage bar had to be removed. Fantastic for us women, but when you think how many years on do we actually have equality in terms of pay, women on boards, balance of our diversity? No. But would we have gotten there without Europe? Probably not to the extent where we're at now. Minority groups, LGBTQI community members, Erasmus Plus, and the benefits of that. But they're only pools of groups. Wherein how do we give that overall sense of I'm Irish and I'm European and here's why I'm proud of it? That for me is where I think we need to work on and chisel away as a centrist, progressive centrist, before we start giving us more superpowers to impact change. We have to get the grassroots right in order for us to enact other ways. But that might be
it's a
maybe
chicken and egg story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much for coming and making the time. I really appreciate the chat. And thank you. It was great to have you.
Yeah, likewise. And I hopefully this won't be, well, we'll see at many more Strasbourgs in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In case anybody's on the lighter note, and I shouldn't say this, it is very difficult to get here, isn't it?
Yes. It is indeed.
And it's
trains, planes, and automobiles.
It's so romantic and beautiful city. Highly recommend. But in Strasbourg, it's very difficult to get here. But here we come once a month. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Maria Walsh. I hope that was informative to you guys. And I don't know if I'm gonna just check if we have any questions. One is a bit rude, so I'm not gonna read that one. There was one that I was talking about before Maria came in, which is the whole vaccine procurement issue, and I do think it's worth answering that. By the way, if you do want to pick up on any second questions about what we just chatted about, that tell me. I'm going to check now the YouTube live stream and see if there's God, how do I get up? I can't see it. Never mind. Okay, so on the vaccine procurement, what a tangled tale. So part of the problem with how the vaccine procurement worked is it was really it was done in an obscure way that from the beginning was not transparently explained to people, and it created an enormous amount of confusion. There was an opportunity for people to get really upset. It was a moment of extremely high tension, right? People were dying of COVID. People were desperate to get vaccines. It seemed like other other countries were getting ahead of Europe. It was a very tense situation. So how did it work? The Commission had a key role in coordinating the procurement of vaccines, right? Why? The member states decided to do it that way on purpose because they wanted it to go through one EU negotiation process, because otherwise you would have France versus Germany versus Ireland versus Poland in a bidding war with pharmaceutical companies, and the member states recognized that they would all be losers in that scenario because it would bid up prices, it would pit member states against each other. You'd have the biggest countries like Germany with much more clout, much more ability, money to throw at the pharmaceutical companies. You know, if you're making a bigger order, you might get it quicker, and so on. So they decided to do this in this common negotiation system, right? How did they do that? In the beginning, before the kind of Commission got its shoes on in terms of this process, a smaller group of member states actually started to make progress on this already with the pharmaceutical companies. Then this former group was sort of retroactively joined in with this Commission, And it ended up that the representatives of that former group, this is confusing, but the initial group of member states that had been the first movers on this, they formed a kind of a committee which were leading on the vaccine procurement. That was the sort of condition. Okay, Commission, you can come in, you can be involved. We'll do this as a pan-EU thing. But all of us want to seat at the table, us original 6 or however many member states it was. I don't even remember. But, so anyway, long story short, the member states were at the table ordering, what should happen, deciding what should happen. Commission was negotiating. Member states had different views then. This is where the confusion and the delays began to get introduced, because member states had different views. So, like, for example, countries with less funds were more concerned about overbuying, whereas the wealthier countries were like, just throw the money at them, let's just get these vaccines. Some member states had preferences for different vaccines. This is hard to remember now, but initially AstraZeneca was like the star vaccine. It was super cheap. I mean, a fraction of what the other ones cost, the mRNA ones. I think a shot of AstraZeneca was something in the order of like €2 or €3, whereas mRNA were more like €16, €18, this kind of thing. AstraZeneca also does not have to be refrigerated, whereas those mRNA vaccines had to be frozen at this like extreme temperature. And in order to roll out a national vaccination campaign, which actually is a massively complicated thing to begin with, if it involves deep freeze like that, you need to have specialist deep freeze freezers, you need to have cold storage, logistics, trucks, stuff like that. It's a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult than if you don't need to worry about that kind of deep refrigeration. So some member states were much more keen to get AstraZeneca. That was the one that they wanted. Others were like just much more willing to spend the extra cash, much more willing to go for these slightly more novel mRNA vaccines. So there were differences from the beginning. This caused some delays. I'm not a legal expert. People have different views on this about the robustness of the contracts that the Commission signed. The view of some is that they weren't, they at least allowed AstraZeneca to think that they could prioritise other countries ahead of the EU, and that the fault falls on the Commission. This actually ended up in court, and that court did find that AstraZeneca had actually committed a grave fault in the way that it met that or did not meet that contract. So it's a kind of disputed issue. The main reason for delays in vaccination is because of that AstraZeneca shortfall. The other vaccine manufacturers, actually, particularly Pfizer, actually delivered more vaccines than they had been expected to. The AstraZeneca shortfall, though, was really profound. I mean, I think in the first, it's hard to remember all these details now, but was it the first 3 months of 2020, AstraZeneca was supposed or had been initially expected to deliver 120 million shots and ended up delivering like 29 million. So like a tiny, tiny amount. It would have been a completely different story if AstraZeneca had come through on that expected delivery. There wouldn't have been this entire debate. Anyway, so now the EU sort of strategy has entirely pivoted to mRNA vaccines. Many European states have overtaken the countries that initially got a head start, like the UK, Israel, definitely the United States and so on. The countries with the highest level of vaccination we're like France. France has, since its vaccine mandate, has a really, really high, I think it's above 90% vaccination rate. Ireland is extremely high. It's something around like 92. Malta as well, I'm going to say something like 91. Malta's really, really small, 350,000 people, and they actually got up very high very early on. I guess it's easier to get more vaccines that make a meaningful difference to the proportion of your population if you're smaller. So yeah, there's in this anguished time when there was a shortage of vaccines, what happened? Those differences in opinion between different member states in terms of what vaccines they wanted and so on, those persisted. So every EU member state was given the opportunity to have exactly the same number of vaccines at the same time in proportion to their population. But not all the member states actually took it up. Some member states turned down Pfizer vaccines, mRNA vaccines. Other member states were very, very interested to get more if they could. How was that discrepancy resolved between some member states giving up some vaccines, others getting more? Well, it was resolved in very untransparent backroom negotiations that we don't actually know that much about, generally done between member states with groups of member states and so on. It's an area which is just a bit of a black hole. This led to discrepancies in the rate of vaccination and the initial amounts of vaccines that were arriving. Ireland got some extras, but it was slow off the mark, so it didn't get extras in like the initial hustle for extra vaccines that other member states turned down. Later on, though, it did. It got extra Modernas, for example. Now it's bought a ton off Romania. The situation that we are in now is that like some member states are approaching like 100% of the adult population vaccinated, whereas others are on very, very low percentage rates. Like I think in Bulgaria, something like 23% of adults vaccinated, and in Romania it's in the 30s. So really, really low percentages over in the East. There was a mess with this stuff. You know, the geopolitics came into it. People started buying Russian vaccines, Chinese vaccines. Some of these vaccines now seem to have limited efficacy, but Beijing, for example, was very, very keen to, you know, be the hero and come in with vaccines for all. So, you know, there was lots of opportunity to jump at Chinese or Russian vaccines at various points. You know, this kind of deeply politicized vaccine issue is not great for public confidence in the vaccines. You know, if people are doing it for political reasons rather than just based on these impartial scientific trials that show that they protect you from being hospitalized or killed by COVID-19, like it's just a very different situation in different countries. What are we going to do about this now? I mean, it seems that countries that still have a large population of unvaccinated people have a real trouble keeping a lid on COVID. So, I mean, countries like Germany, for example, still, even though they have access to all of the vaccines they need, they still haven't hit the 70% mark in terms of adults vaccinated. So this is an issue because we're now heading into winter, and we know now from experience what happens when all the schools come back, when all the universities come back, when everyone starts meeting again in rooms, chatting like we did, and whatever it is about winter that, you know, makes illnesses spread. I have a question from Irish Agreement. The EU should have chosen a former head of state as High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy instead of Borrell, who practically nobody had ever heard of before. Yeah. I mean, I think that... What can I say about that? Picking former prime ministers. Like, they usually say that former prime ministers are good for certain roles because they have, like, a clout and so on. And yeah, maybe there's something to the name recognition and stuff that you have internationally. Kind of running out of puff here. Guys, I may wrap up this live stream because I don't want to just like talk myself out. So just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, my plan is I'm going to try and have a chat with every Irish MEP. That's my aim, if they can make the time for me. And I'll be asking similar questions like what I asked to Maria Walsh, like, what are you using the position to do? What are the policy issues that are like your fave or whatever, the really important ones? What do people misunderstand about the European Parliament? How could it be made better? And also like talking about the stuff we were talking about, like with the EPP, the behind the scenes politics that goes on in this place and that shapes things. That I don't know. I don't think we hear that much about in Ireland. I don't know. What do you think? So cool. It was a fun first stream, and if you want any questions answered or you have any suggestions for future such chats, you know where to find me on Twitter. Cool. Cheers, guys. Bye. I'm gonna end.